Um, Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I'm thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are at the beginning of reading Hannah Arendt's book, The Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. One of her, probably her most read book, certainly the most popular. It was originally written as a series of journalistic essays for the New Yorker, as we talked about last week, and it has that element to it. It's I think in many ways her most accessible book, in the sense that it's really written for a popular audience. On the other hand, especially when we get later in the book, in the middle, you're going to get a lot of history, a lot of facts. This is a very historical book in some ways, especially in the middle sections. But at the beginning, where we are now, we're reading chapter 2, which is called The Accused. And if you'll remember from last week, she begins the book by saying, this is a book about justice. And justice requires that we actually pay attention to the accused. And she accuses the prosecution, the prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, of not paying attention to the accused, right? She says that he has sought, in line with Ben-Gurion, to make it into a show trial, to bring in all of this evidence from witnesses and documents about the Holocaust, the Shoah, that had nothing to do with Eichmann, much of it. Like, there was one 37-volume work that was introduced into evidence in which Eichmann's name was not mentioned once. And she says this is an evidence that they're not actually pursuing justice so much as they're trying to make a political point. And others have said, true, you got that right, but that's okay. The trial was not about justice alone. It was about a political point, about trying to teach people about the Holocaust, about trying to make a moral point for Israelis. Um, and Arendt is saying, well, fine, but no, it's important to hold on to the idea that a criminal trial should be about justice. And she says the first requirement of justice in a criminal trial is that we actually ask the question of, did the defendant do what they are accused of? And then did they have the requisite intent to do what they are accused of? Which is in law, did they have the actus reus? Did they do a bad act or a guilty act? And secondly, did they have the guilty mind, the mens rea, and therefore have the intent? Because we don't punish people who do wrong accidentally or without intent. Now she says, okay, if that's the case, we better pay attention to the accused. And so chapter 2 is an attempt to do that. She begins by giving his full name, right? Otto Adolf Eichmann, son of Karl Adolf Eichmann. And she gives a little bit of his biography. The biography comes, right, interestingly enough, from a biography that he writes of himself in Argentina, when he's being interviewed by Sasson, and thus is part of the Sasson materials, which have become a sort of counter history to Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which we'll talk about and read on as we go forward in our reading of this book. In any case, she begins by saying that he's charged with 15 counts. This is a legalistic argument or legalistic beginning. And when we get to the last chapter of the book, this will come back. and she's going to talk about very specifically the 15 counts that he's accused of. But here she just says that they're in 3 batches. One batch is crimes against the Jewish people. Another batch is crimes against humanity. And the third batch is war crimes. And one of the things that she's going to do, again, at the end of the book, is argue that these are very different and we should not confuse them. Um, uh, and so here she simply, in a sense, prefigures that discussion by saying there are 3 different batches of crimes. And it's also important that if you look on that first page, that she says that he was captured by the Mossad on May 11th, 1960, flown to Israel 9 days later, brought to trial in the District Court of Jerusalem on April 11th, 1961, and stood accused on 15 counts, quote, together with others, that he had committed crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity and war crimes. It's not an accident that she puts in quotes that he is accused of doing this together with others, because this is going to be one of the biggest issues in the trial and in her book as well. Is he individually guilty? Did he do something? Or was this something of a conspiracy where he worked with others? And, he's not even charged here of doing something himself. He's charged of doing something together with others. And this is going to become a theme of the book and something which is interesting. The last thing I'll point about just about these charges is that the charges are for doing these 3 different kinds of crimes together with others during the whole period of the Nazi regime, and especially during World War II. The temporality of his crimes is actually going to become important, because Arendt is going to argue that there were 3 different phases of culpability. There was sort of all the culpability of what he did prior to the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Then after the Nuremberg laws between 1935 and somewhere around 1940, we don't know the date, the exact date, I guess, is complicated. And then post 1940, post the final solution in the Wannsee Conference, there's a 3rd level of culpability. And so from her point of view, we have to sort of be aware that, being a Nazi Party member in 1933 or 34, before the Nuremberg laws, is very different than being a Nazi Party member in 1935 to 1940 after the Nuremberg laws. And that's different itself from being a Nazi Party member after the Wannsee Conference and the beginning of the final solution. I mean, this is something we can come back to in our discussion, but it's actually really important. What's the difference between being a member of a party that, you think might be prejudiced, or you think might have certain racist or prejudiced tendencies, but is still really only talking about legal means of discrimination, or legal means of action, but has not yet passed laws that are taking away people's citizenship. They're talking maybe about deporting people, but only legally, and they're not talking about, they don't have yet laws proposed to take people's citizenships away. Is the culpability of being a part of that party the same as being part of that party after they start passing laws taking away people's citizenship? That's obviously something that may become an issue in the United States and in other countries around the world. And how do you judge and how do you think about the different levels of culpability at what time in these situations? So she then says, and I think this is interesting, I hadn't really paid attention to it before, but Eichmann is actually tried under a 1950 law called the Nazis and Nazi Collaborator Punishment Law, which is which is passed by the Israeli Knesset in the first session of the Knesset after the independence of Israel. And interestingly enough, the law's target were Jews. The law targeted Jews who collaborated with the Nazis in camps, namely mostly capos or prisoner functionaries, and the Jewish ghetto police. And so from 1948 until this trial in 1961, about 40 people were put on trial for violating this law, and about 2/3 of those were convicted, and they were Jews. Uh, uh, Eichmann was the first non-Jew, I believe, who was tried and convicted under this Israeli law. And so I think that gives it also an interesting, and as we talk about later in the book, when we get there, when Arendt talks about collaborators and things, it's, you know, a lot of the criticism of her book is saying, oh, she mentioned collaborators, but the very law that Eichmann is charged under of violating is a law that was originally aimed at Jewish collaborators during the war. Okay, moving on. When Eichmann is charged with these laws, he pleads not guilty in the sense of the indictment. This is this is the first page, still 21. And Arendt says, what does this mean? And interestingly enough, she says, nobody ever asked him. Nobody ever said, you know, Mr. Witness, what do you mean not guilty in the sense of the indictment? His lawyer, a German lawyer who he chose but was paid for by the Israeli court, Servatius, said in an interview that Eichmann feels guilty before God, not before the law. But Arendt is clear that that's what his lawyer said. No one ever asked Eichmann. And for Servatius again, he says that what Eichmann felt is that he had followed German law, and if you are decorated if you win, and you go to the gallows if you lose. This is, of course, a version of Goebbels' famous statement that we will go down in history as the greatest statesmen of all times if we win, or as the greatest criminals if we lose. On page 22, she quotes Eichmann again here, saying one important point, which for him was very important, where he says, with the killing of the Jews, I had nothing to do. I never killed a Jew, or a non-Jew for that matter. I never killed any human being. I never gave an order to kill either a Jew or a non-Jew. I just didn't do it. That's on page 22. She says, he also said, and this is a quote that she makes a lot of, he said, it so happened that I had not once to do it, which she thinks, of course, is wildly revealing, insofar as the point is that he didn't kill anyone or order to kill anyone because he was never asked to. That wasn't his job, right? His job was to organize emigrations early on in the war, and then deportations later in the war, and then deportations to death camps and in the final stage of the war. And she says he left no doubt that he would have killed his father if he'd been ordered to, but he was never ordered to kill anyone, and so he didn't. He repeated what he had already told Sasson, the journalist in Buenos Aires, that really all he could be accused of was aiding and abetting the annihilation of Jews, which he called himself one of the greatest crimes in the history of humanity. Now, this is going to again become interesting, because when the court makes its judgment, what it says is, if we had to say what Eichmann is legally guilty of, it's aiding and abetting. And so in a sense, the court comes to agree with Eichmann that what he really was guilty of is aiding and abetting the Holocaust. Where they disagree is they say that aiding and abetting the Holocaust in a crime of such magnitude, the further you are away from the actual killing, actually, the more your responsibility increases. And so that becomes their attempt to understand how he can be held so fully responsible, even though he didn't actually kill anyone. There's an interesting 2-page discussion that Arendt engages in, where again Gideon Hausner tries to prove that Eichmann actually did kill one person. He thinks he has some evidence that Eichmann killed a young boy in Hungary, and Arendt says he completely failed to do so, and the court and she both agree that there was no evidence that he'd ever killed anyone. The second thing he tried to prove, which she says he was more successful in proving, is that Eichmann may have once given an order to kill, although Arendt is skeptical of that as well. There's a testimony of a note, handwritten, scribbled by Franz Rademacher, who was a German foreign affairs officer. And he was in communication with General Boehm, who was a general in Yugoslavia when the German troops are being attacked by Yugoslavian partisans. And they begin to kill the Jews that they have in their camps as a way of deterring the attacks by the partisans. We have to remember that the Jews, even though they're Jews, were also Yugoslavians. And as a result, they thought that they could deter the partisan attacks on the German army by killing, I think, multiple Jews for every German that is killed by a partisan. And Boehm first asked, can we deport the Jews? And as a result, he's referred to Eichmann, because Eichmann's in charge of deportations. And Eichmann says, no, you can't deport them because we already, all the trains are busy deporting other Jews, so you can't do that. We don't have the space for it. And Rademacher, I guess, communicates this to Boehm, and he scribbles on this paper, Eichmann says, just shoot them. Uh, uh, you know, Arendt says, we don't know if this is actually the case. Eichmann certainly didn't remember it. If it was a phone call, and you can imagine what it is. Boehm is killing Jews. He wants to deport them. And Eichmann probably said, maybe, shoot the Jews, or just shoot them. And, she says, this is the closest we can get to any evidence that he either killed or ordered the killing of Jews. But Arendt says it's sort of ridiculous because there's no way that a lowly lieutenant colonel like actually he was even lower than that at that time, would do an order that would be needed by a general in the army to kill the Jews or shoot the Jews. So that's as close as we get. And again, this is all an attempt to ask the two questions that she thinks justice requires. Actus reus, right? Was there a guilty act? Well, there was no killing. Was there a ordering to kill? And this is the one piece of evidence in the entire trial in which you see a piece of evidence that Eichmann may have ordered Jews to be killed. So why does she do this? Well, because she wants to ask this question of, who is this guy? What did he do? And is he guilty? And she says, what we now have to think about is who he is and go to his intent. What was his intent? Was he somebody who had the intent to kill Jews? And this begins on page 24. And she asks, would he have pleaded guilty if he'd been indicted as an accessory to murder? As someone who didn't murder, but aided and abetted murder. And she says, perhaps he would have made Perhaps, but he would have made an important qualification. What he had done was a crime only in retrospect, and he'd always been a law-abiding citizen because Hitler's orders, which he had certainly executed to the best of his ability, had possessed the force of law in the Third Reich. So she says that if we understand Eichmann, he saw himself as a law-abiding citizen. He saw himself as executing the orders given to him, and not just the orders, the laws, because as she then quotes legal experts as saying, the laws of the Fuhrer, the claims of the Fuhrer were considered to have legal validity in the Third Reich. So, uh, she's saying he saw himself as a law-abiding citizen and not as someone who broke the law. Okay, well, was he an inner swine? She asks. Ein innerer Schweinehund. Was he like an evil pig-like person? Um, and he says, well, I acted lawfully and conscientiously. And she says her answer on the page 25 was, this was admittedly hard to take, right? She obviously doesn't credit him on this claim very well. The idea that he was just a law-abiding person. Um, okay, but what else can we know about it? He says he did not want to be the one who said they had always been against it, right? He doesn't, he says, look, I could tell you now that I was against it and I was just following the law or orders, but that would be wrong. He says that he now sees that what he did was wrong. Um, but he says when he did it thinking it was the right thing to do, because it was what the law told him to do, and he saw himself as a good law-abiding citizen. Again, she says this is somewhat hard to take, but this is his argument. He does say he proposes to hang himself in public as a warning example for all anti-Semites on this earth. But he says, I have no regrets for what I did. Repentance is for little children, is his line. When he was asked if he had any pity for Jews amidst a negotiation where he was going to save some Jews in return for money, he answered, I am here under oath and must speak the truth. Not out of mercy did I launch this transaction. My reasons, I decided I had to take matters of immigration into my own hands. He says, look, I didn't act out of mercy for the Jews. I'm not going to say that I did. I followed my orders and laws, and I tried to kill them or help them emigrate, or force them to emigrate, as the case may be. Thus he tried to say, look, I was a law-abiding citizen. I followed the law. I wasn't an innerer Schweinehund. I wasn't a morally bad person. And this is again where she says this was admittedly hard to take. That said, she says that 6 different psychiatrists examined him, and what they said was he had his attitude towards family and friends was not only normal but most desirable. And that one of them said he was more normal than I am after having examined him, right, on page 25. And what Arendt takes from this, and other things that we'll get to as we read more into the book, is that this was not a case of moral or legal insanity. That's on page 26. And again, this is one of her key insights and one that I think we have to struggle with. Eichmann was not insane. He was not insane legally, but he was also not insane morally. Maybe there's a kind of insanity that makes you so feel that you have to obey the law that you ignore any other morals, feelings. But if anything, she says this is normal. Um, in addition, she says it was also not a case of insane hatred of the Jews or fanatical anti-Semitism or indoctrination of any kind. Now, Eichmann will later on in the book be quoted as saying he wasn't an anti-Semite. Arendt said at that point says, we're not going to judge you on that, but we are inclined not to believe you. She clearly thinks he was an anti-Semite, but she doesn't think he was a fanatical anti-Semite. So for example, Julius Streicher, the one of the most fanatical anti-Semites of the period, who edited the anti-Semitic magazine Der Stürmer, um, uh, you know, in the trial, Eichmann calls him a sort of pornographic anti-Semite, and Eichmann distances himself from him. And Arendt, uh, accepts that he wasn't this kind of fanatical um, anti-Semite. In fact, and what she says, he was normal. He was probably an anti-Semite, like most Germans were anti-Semites at the time. Um, uh, and the problem was that he was too normal. What you needed were people who were not normal, who could extricate themselves from the German social and legal system. She then turns again back to his biography. And interestingly enough, one of the main sources here is the autobiography he writes when he's in um, Argentina, while he's having the interviews with Sasson. Now, this autobiography was not admitted at trial. Arendt never got to read it, but parts of it were published in Der Aufbau, which was a German publication, German Jewish publication at the time. And Harry Mulisch, who is another reporter, got to read it for half an hour, and Arendt talked to him about it and was able to get some sense of it for him. And between those two sources, she pieces together this early biography of him. And she emphasizes a few points. One is that he was a Gottgläubiger, which is a German word for someone who breaks with Christianity. And Eichmann took this fairly seriously. He refused to take an oath on the Bible at the trial because he wasn't a Christian. But this Gottgläubiger, this sort of religion of the Gottgläubiger, which is not Christian but has Christian elements, is very interesting. And Arendt emphasizes one really important aspect of it, which she thinks is essential to understand Eichmann and people like him, which is that God is named in this religion die höheren Sinnesträger, the highest bearer of meaning or sense. God is someone who bears the responsibility for fate and for the world. He's a bearer of sense and responsibility. Similarly, those who knew about the final solution called themselves Geheimnisträger, or the bearer of secrets. And people who were part of the bureaucracy in the way that Eichmann was called themselves Befehlsträger, the bearers of commands. Now, this was a change in terminology because before the Nazis, people in the German bureaucracy were called Befehlsempfänger, receivers of commands. The idea is that a bureaucrat received commands and then carried them out. But the Nazis changed it from a receiver of commands to a Träger, a bearer of commands. And this is important because the Nazis saw themselves as willing to sacrifice for a higher cause. And I think, one of the questions that people constantly ask about, the Tea Party movement or the New Right, or even earlier than that, the Kevin Phillips book, What's the Matter with Kansas, is they ask, why do people vote against their self-interest? Why do impoverished or poorer people or the lower classes vote for people who are going to actually not help the lower classes? And I think one of the answers to this question is that for people who are destitute or poor or frustrated with their lives, it's not always about monetary self-interest. I mean, this is where the Marxist argument breaks down. When my students want to tell me it's all about the money, it's not all about the money. It's about the money, yeah, that works, but it's also about meaning. It's about having a sense of purpose. And the Nazis understood that profoundly. And so the point is, they they made their followers into bearers, people who would sacrifice for a higher cause. Um, he was thus, and this is where being part of a movement becomes essential to understanding Eichmann and what he did. Um, on page 28 and 29, she goes into some further characterizations of Eichmann, and she talks about his incredible penchant for lying. He lied about everything. And and this is it becomes part of his métier, part of who he is. So much so that sometimes he seems to lie to himself and not know what's true or false anymore. And this is obviously going to become part of her reading of him and of people like him. He also was an incredible braggart. He had to elevate himself on page 29 and make himself important. And this goes with the sense of lying and bragging in the service of trying to give his life meaning, to try and show that he was important. He may not make a lot of money, he may not have done well economically, but he played a role in a movement, and that was what gave his life purpose and meaning. She also talks on page 30 about why he thought that he was not someone who hated Jews. And it turns out that he has a Jewish relation who was a cousin of his stepmother, um, who helped him get a job when he was down and out, when he was still in Austria. And he says on page 31, she quotes him as saying, "My mother," which I think is his stepmother, "because of her Jewish relatives, held different opinions from those current in the SS circles." Now, could he be making this up, as some people would say, and lying? Possibly. But Arendt at least takes seriously that he felt uh, very that it was very important to him to say, look, he had nothing personal against the Jews. She thinks that another reason for this is that he also had a Jewish mistress in the early 1930s. This would be between 1933, I think, and 1935. Now, that's important because after 1935, according to the Nuremberg laws, having a Jewish mistress or even having sex with a Jewish woman was something called the Rassenschande, a shame of the race, and was a serious crime. And so the fact that Eichmann had an apparently loving relationship with a Jewish woman at this period, but before the Nuremberg laws, she thinks at least is some evidence to take seriously his claim that he had nothing personal against Jews, and the fact that he also helped a couple of his relatives who were Jews emigrate at this period. In 1932 to 33, she talks about how during his work at the vacuum factory as a salesman, he gets transferred to Salzburg and begins to lose his joy at work. And it was around this time that he started to think he had to join something to give his life meaning. And there are two different groups that Eichmann thinks to join. One are the Freemasons, and the other are the burgeoning Nazi Party while he's still in Austria. Um, he was a joiner, she says, and it's this need to join. He joined youth movements as a child. He was going to try to join the Freemason Lodge. And then his school friend, Kaltenbrunner, says, don't join the Freemasons, come and join the Nazis. And he did. And Arendt says, it's important to understand that in 1933, when he joins, 32 to 33, when he joins, he could have joined the Freemasons and he could have joined the Nazis. He didn't join the Nazis out of conviction, she says. He joined because he had a problem with the Freemasons. It looked like they might not let him in. His friend Kaltenbrunner wanted him to join the Nazis. And she says he could have ended up joining the Freemasons and become a respectable Philistine. I love the way she speaks about it. Whose worst vice was an irrepressible desire for practical jokes. And instead, he joined the Nazis and became part of the marching columns of the Thousand-Year Reich, which lasted exactly 12 years and 3 months. And so this is part of her attempt to understand him, that he didn't join out of conviction. He joined out of a need to be part of something at a time when he was, in a sense, depressed and feeling like a failure and feeling like he had not done well. He had dropped out of high school. He had never gone to college. Was not doing well at work, and he joined this movement. And so she writes in this, I think, fairly famous phrase, from a humdrum life without significance and consequence, the wind had blown him into history as he understood it, namely into a movement that always kept moving and in which someone like him, already a failure in the eyes of his social class, of his family, and hence in his own eyes as well, could start from scratch and still make a career. Even amidst his frustrations and failures, he could start over in the movements. And so when the Nazis then were outlawed in Austria, he moved to Germany. They told him he had to become a soldier, so he went to train as a soldier. He hated it. He couldn't make it. And he heard that a new security service run by Himmler was starting and was hiring. And so he applied and was hired into the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the SD, which would later become part of the Schutzstaffel or the SS. That's the end of this chapter on the accused. Who is this man? It's a mix of biography, facts of his early life leading up to when he joins the party, and some characterizations of him, trying to think about who he is and how we understand him. The next chapter, chapter 3, is called An Expert on the Jewish Question, and it begins actually talking about his career as a member of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the RSHA, which is where he then worked for the next 12 years. All right, I will stop there. We have time for Q&A. Remember, you can enter the chat, and please just be respectful, but feel free to have a vibrant chat. You can disagree with each other, but please don't attack anyone personally. And you can also raise your hand and engage in the conversation this way. We may end a little early because I'm in the middle of a conference here and have to run to it, but I'll try and take as many of the questions as I can. Jerry, good to see you.
Thanks, Roger. This question is prompted by your tone of voice. And it's when you were talking about that Eichmann responded that he is not guilty in the sense of the indictment. And I wondered if that is something you wanted to come back to later, which is very possible, I think, or a little bit later this afternoon. You talked about being one's responsibility increasing with one's distance from the game. Just a factual matter, are these things connected in your mind? The two that you mentioned today, or is that other question about in the sense of the charge something you will care to come back to later?
It's a good question. I see why you're asking it. And let me say that here's my attempt to think it through, right? When the court says in their final judgment that responsibility increases the farther you are from the actual act. I mean, it's a paraphrase. I don't have the quote right in front of me. What it's saying is that what he did, he didn't kill anyone, and he maybe never even ordered anyone to kill, but he was part of a bureaucracy of mass murder, and he was a central part of it. And in that sense, he's more responsible than someone who pulled a trigger, which is, and that Himmler would even be more responsible, although Himmler probably did give orders. But the point is, the higher you go up, often the less directly you are implicated in a sort of heinous crime of murder. But the crime is not murder. The crime is participation in mass bureaucratic genocide. And so that would be so the responsibility increases at the end. I don't think I think that that's what he means when he says not guilty in the sense of the indictment. I mean, we don't know what he means because, as Arendt said, no one ever asked him. But I think what she thinks he means, and I generally think I agree with her. I'm giving a lot of qualifications here, but this is somewhat speculative. Is that he thinks I was someone who obeyed the law. I obeyed the law faithfully. Even when I thought the law was wrong, I was a Befehlsträger. I was a bearer of my orders, and I overwhelmed my own sense of maybe moral repulsion at times, and did what I was told. And later in the book, in the middle of the book, we'll read about this. This is one of the most fascinating chapters of the book. He's going to cite Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative, and say that I must set myself under the universal law, and who am I to not obey the orders, the laws, not the orders, the laws given to me. And so I'm a lawful and law-abiding citizen. I think what he means is I did what I followed the law. I was a good citizen. I happened to be a good citizen in a bad state, right? So Aristotle, in his Politics, makes the distinction between a good citizen and a good person, or a good man. Good person I'll stick with. And Aristotle says in the Politics, right, that a good citizen is regime dependent. You can be a good citizen, and if it's a bad regime, you're a bad person, even though you're a good citizen. And I think Eichmann is simply saying something along those lines. And he's saying, I realize now, right, that what we did was wrong. Now, whether you credit him with that or not, whether you believe that he did that or not, I think is a big question. I don't think Arendt believes it fully. I don't think she believes it at all, actually. But I think she takes seriously that he believed it. And I think that's what he meant by it, is that, I am guilty in some way because I realize that I have done something truly wrong, the worst crime in in the history of humanity, he says. But what I did was not breaking laws or aiding and abetting. What I did was following laws that were, at the time, I thought were valid laws and that I had a duty to follow. I think that's what he has in mind. I mean, Jerry, you've written on this book maybe more than anybody, or as much as anybody. I mean, do you have an opinion on that?
No, not more than it's something I've actually not thought a great deal about, and until today. And it's all very interesting, especially when your answer just now, you mentioned Kant. Well, we'll get to that, of course, but I mean, it is terribly important, I think, to realize that to mention Kant in the context of Eichmann, which Arendt devotes one chapter to, is tremendously nuanced. The moral voice that Kant heard within was hardly that of Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Roger.
Yes, and I see that in the chat, people are saying that too. I don't mean to say that Eichmann got Kant right. That's not what I meant to say at all. Arendt is going to explain why he got Kant wrong, but his reading of Kant is actually a fairly common misreading of Kant, and um, and and I think it's not accidental that this high school dropout who had read his little Kant um, did internalize this sense that, well, I have a lot of duties, but my main duty is to be a good citizen. And I think that's how he.
Roger, do you actually know of cases where criminals have said that? That they have gone to interpret Kant in that way? I do not.
No, I don't. I no, I don't. I just think that it's a common. I think that a lot of criminals, in a lot of people who are bureaucratic criminals, think of themselves as, you know, following orders, even if the orders are orders they disagree with. I think it's a common stance of bureaucratic wrongdoing. But I don't know of anyone who's ever cited Kant for it. But I don't think most bureaucrats in the United States have read Kant, whereas in 1930s in Austria, obviously he did in high school somewhere along the line. Um, I don't know if that speaks well for teaching Kant in high school or badly, because maybe high school students are too young to get it. Um, but we'll see. Thank you, Jerry. Stephen, you're up.
But Roger, can I say very quickly, some of the defendants that many of the defendants in Nuremberg pleaded not guilty in the sense of the indictments. So I'm wondering if that language is copied from there.
That could be I hadn't known that. This is Taylor, I think. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Uh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you know more about it, then tell me, but that I think supports the basic argument that a lot of them said, look, I may be guilty, but my guilt's, I was a law abiding or in Nuremberg, they usually said I was following orders. Um, what Eichmann said, and this is a distinction that Arendt makes a lot of, is that he wasn't following orders, that he was following laws. Um, and in any case, I think that distinction, that they were following orders or laws as opposed to breaking a law, is part of what's going on here. So thank you. Stephen.
Hi, Roger. I'm struggling with Arendt's, she gives a lot of passes to Eichmann's story, and she takes him at his word in some places. In other places, she calls him out for lying. He takes credit. He's a braggart. So I'm wondering, on what ground does she make this characterization? Because it's not really a psychological profile. Being a joiner, what does that mean? There's so many incongruities in this chapter where she says, talking about the God believer, the God Glaubbiger, and she doesn't really go into the depth of what that means ideologically and whether or not he was indoctrinated. And I think it's also important that I'm finding in my own exploration of this chapter and all the other material that's come post Arendt, with regard to the profile of the people who joined the SD, which was the intelligence agency for the SS, right? So I draw attention to this book here by Christian Ingrao, called Believe or Die, Intellectuals in the SS War Machine. And has two chapters on being a Nazi, one being a Nazi, and the people who entered the SD who were recruited. This is the elite of the elite. The book follows 88 intellectuals, 80% of whom were in the SD and were responsible on levels, high levels. Though Eichmann wasn't an intellectual, he was a follower of these people. He wouldn't have been admitted to the SD had he not been a follower of an ideology. So I'm just wondering why she's so sympathetic in her characterization, and she doesn't seem to pick up that he's an indoctrinated Nazi.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. So, I mean, look, these are good questions. First of all, I think I'll just say, I think it's a mistake to say that she's sympathetic. I mean, her contempt for Eichmann, I think, basically melts off the page. She calls him, a member of the lower classes. She talks about how he's, has no class, no thought. This is not a sympathetic portrayal. It's a portrayal of someone she thinks is, well, I mean, she'll use the word later, but clearly she has it in her mind, banal and thoughtless. And someone who cares about his status above all, and that he, as his father had been a middle-class person who'd lost his job, lost money, and had to go down in life. And Eichmann, was someone who was a social climber, something she has contempt for. So I don't think it's a sympathetic account. That said, I take Stephen's point, right, to some degree, which is that, she listens to him and she tries to, she listens to him and she tries to understand, who is this guy? What does he think? Now, when you do that, how can you know, right? I mean, I forget what word you used, Stephen. It was interesting. I thought it was very good. But I mean, it's an amateurish account. She's not a psychologist, right? She's not a psychiatrist. She's listening to him and trying to say, all right, uh, you know, how do I make sense of this guy who says, well, I never was personally hated Jews, yet he joined a virulently anti-Semitic organization. What do you believe and what don't you believe? Did he do it simply because it was a way to move up in the world? She doesn't think so. Did he do it because it was a way to move up in the world and because it gave him a sense of meaning and belonging to a movement that would help him? She thinks that those two together explain a lot. Does that mean he was not anti-Semitic? She says not at all. She says he probably was anti-Semitic. But what she thinks is that it wasn't simply because he was an indoctrinated anti-Semite, at least at the beginning. I think there's an open question to be asked, right? And I think it's a question Arendt never answers, although she certainly asks it. At some point, does he become a committed anti-Semite, in his time working with the Nazis? And I think that that's a question that's worth asking. We'll never know. I don't think you'll ever know the answer to it. There are people who think they do, right? So, for example, Bettina Stengneth, who I've mentioned a number of times and we'll continue to read, and we're going to read some chapters of her book at the end of our discussion, because I think it's become part of the discussion and it's very important and it's a good book, Eichmann for Jerusalem, or Eichmann before Jerusalem, argues that Eichmann lied and Arendt was taken in by it. She argues that that Eichmann was a virulent anti-Semite, and and that and Arendt just was fooled by him. How does she know that, right? The easy and I think wrong answer is she had access to the Sassen papers and Arendt didn't. I don't think that works, because a large part of the Sassen papers, and in fact, all of the quotes that Bettina Stengnet brings forward to make her point that were part of the Sassen papers were already published and that Arendt read. So you have to make the argument that, in some sense, given largely the same information, Arendt was fooled and Stengnet was not. And when I put this question directly to Stengnet in a conversation we had once, her answer was, well, I know when he's lying and Arendt didn't. And, my answer to that was, how do you know? And she's like, well, that's a professional secret. I can't reveal that. And I said, okay, but, hard to know how to address that. Um, but it's, the question you asked, Stephen, is a good one. How does Arendt know when Eichmann is lying? And how does she not? How does Stengnet know when Eichmann's lying? And how does she not? I don't know. In some sense, we're all looking at the material and we have to make our judgments. I mean, when Arendt calls him a liar, there's different ways in which she calls him a liar. Sometimes she says, well, there's actually a fact here that shows he was lying, right? She says one of the things about him is he just had a terrible memory for what he did, which could be a convenient memory, it could be lies or whatever. But she says there were a number of instances where he said things and then evidence was brought out and he was clearly lying, and she calls those out as lies. Other times he says things and she says, well, that's sort of hard to believe, but we don't know. But it's clearly she thinks he's lying, but we don't know. So I don't know how to know. Unlike Miss Stengnet, who I, have respect for in many ways, and I think her book's a fantastic book, and I've said so and reviewed it very positively. Um, uh, I don't think we can know for sure, and I'm not someone who's willing to be able to say. Um, so yeah, that's all I can add there.
My only response would be that post Arendt, the German archives were opened up to people like Christian Ingrau, and that if we look at the milieu in which he operated, we might find the answer to what motivated his lies. I mean, he was absorbed in an ideology which wasn't very clear, because there were many strains of this ideology running through the confirmed Nazi.
Yeah.
And I think if we can pull up that material, then we can then make judgment. And that puts Arendt in conversation with contemporary thinkers on these issues. And thank you for turning me on to Deborah Lipstadt. I heard her discussion with you, which I thought was very interesting and stimulated a lot of thought, but I know you want to get away to your conference. So thanks for your time.
No, but I want to add it because I think that's really what you just said is important. You talked about the German archives have opened up and it gives evidence or insight into the milieu in which Eichmann was, and I think that's fair. That said, here, right? She's talking about up until he joined, and in this chapter, all we're doing is up until he joined. And, he was not hanging out with intellectuals. He was hanging out with vacuum salesmen and other high school dropouts and hangers-on and the Freemasons and things like that. It also is important to note that he never was an intellectual. He never was taken seriously by the higher ups in the hierarchy. He was always upset that he was not promoted higher. He was, he had a very low rank. And that was something he rejected. And one of the reasons he had that low rank is they didn't really have much respect for him. That's something that comes out also in Stangneth's book. Um, so all I'll say is, you know, she's looking at him. And while it's important sometimes to look at the milieu, you also have to look at him. And I also, and this is something I said earlier, but I'll say it again, and I think it fits with your argument, Stephen, actually, which is that I think it's very possible that he started out not as a committed ideologue and became more of one, right? And that I think is, I think I said that earlier. I think that's very likely. Now, we'll come back to this really only when we read the Stangneth book at the very end of our reading. But if you actually read what he said to Sasson, right? That Stangneth makes so much of, and I think she's right to make much of it. What he says is not that I killed the Jews because I hated the Jews. He says I killed the Jews because I wanted the Nazi party to win, and they told me this was the way we had to do it to win. So what is his ideology, right? I think he does. I mean, this is my own personal view. It's not necessarily Arendt's view. I think he does come to imbibe and embody this ideology, but I don't think his own version of that ideology was necessarily that of a fanatic anti-Semite, so much as it was a fanatic believer in the importance of the Nazi party. Now, can you make a distinction between that? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But there's never a time where he says, I hated Jews and I wanted to kill them. Right. And that's an important distinction that I think Arendt makes us at least struggle with. Adolfo, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Adolfo.
It's fine, Roger. For me personally, I think I had the opposite experience, Stephen. I think while reading it, I just started to ask myself, like, do I have the attention span, or am I don't want to say intellectual enough, but sort of, for Arendt's way of arriving at justice, right? It kind of like dawned on me, just like reading this long part about Eichmann. It's like almost like there's something in me that started to ask myself, like, there has to be something about justice where it can be like intrinsic to human beings, where it can just be like a matter of just good judgment. And it's almost like, let's say if you were to like replace this case about Eichmann with like a case in Japan or in China, there has to be something about it that like speaks to just every single person, where it isn't necessarily about being able to read through the story, or there has to be something about perhaps someone like me who just doesn't have the attention span for justice, right? So
can you say more what you mean, Adolfo, by you don't have the attention span for justice? What does that mean?
What I mean by that is, at a certain point, as I was reading the story of Eichmann, right? It kind of felt like I was reading this like dark 19th century novel or something that I just wasn't able to actually read through, just to be honest. It's almost like I was skipping pretty important parts, and I was kind of telling myself, like, okay, let's just get to the end. I mean, this person committed something so atrocious. Do I literally have to sit through why this person got this job, or like what religion this person joined, or like that kind of stuff, And it's like it started to dawn on me, like it's either there has to be something intrinsic or something about justice where it's good judgment, or perhaps like there's an indictment part of this. It implies an indictment of folks who don't have the attention span, the required attention span, to arrive at justice, to really get there where Arendt wants to get us. It's like it requires a lot of struggling, and it's pretty difficult. I don't know. I'll just be honest.
I think that's extraordinary. I absolutely love that question. And I want to thank you for it. And it was so extraordinary that I didn't understand it the first time you asked me. So, thank you. If I understand it, and you tell me if I get it wrong, it's that, look, we all know Eichmann's guilty, right? Why don't we just kill him? Is that the question? Why do we have to go through this process of doing justice to him? Is that the question, just so I understand it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's a moment of honesty. It's honestly how I felt reading it. I was like, let's do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And and she poses that question in the book later, uh in the uh in the chapter on I think it's going to be the chapter on judgment, appeal, and execution, I believe. Or is it not? No. Where is it? It's where she talks about when they kidnapped him and took him, and they could have just killed him there. Darn it, I have to find, I forget where it is. But she'll pose this question later in the book, Adolfo, and she'll say there's an argument that that's what they should have done. They should have just assassinated him in Buenos Aires and not bothered with a trial. What's the point? And and I wrote a piece. I wrote a piece about that first about the Arendt and Eichmann, but I also wrote a piece later about the American assassination of Osama bin Laden. And in a way, I compared them and said, you know, people, the human rights community went crazy when we assassinated Osama bin Laden and said, you know, well, there's no trial, you need to do justice. And I said, well, actually, why bother, right? You don't need, we all knew what Osama bin Laden did. It wasn't like up for grabs. It wasn't up for debate. You don't need to have a trial. And in her, and I relied on Arendt's argument, which is that in some sense, she says it would have been more just to kill him and not go through this whole charade of a trial. But she says, nevertheless, that just seems like revenge. And we go through the charade of the trial because we want, because there's a fundamental principle, she says, which is that it's not that justice has to be done, but justice has to be seen to be done. So we'll come back to this later. Now, she has a solution to that, right? Which is she asks the question, what if the Mossad had just shot him, and then instead of putting him on trial, which was a ridiculous thing because we all know the answer to it, it really was sort of a show trial, put themselves on trial and asked a jury to decide whether they were right to assassinate him or not. And she says, by doing that, even though their extra legal act of revenge was outside the law, they can bring themselves back into the law. I have an article called Assassinating Justly, if you're interested in this, about this very particular question. And I think that in some way, Adolfo Arendt agrees with you, that might have been a more just and better approach. That said, it's not what the Israelis did. And if you're going to put him on trial, she thinks it should be taken seriously as a trial in which justice should be seen to be done. But I think it's an excellent question, and one that should be struggled with. That said, also, I should add, I mean, as long as you have him on trial, she says it's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity to try and understand, I mean, what is the ultimate question of this book, right? I would argue that the ultimate question of this book is an exploration of how easy it is for people who are not insane and not fanatics to turn themselves into participants in bureaucratic mass murder. And insofar as that's a burning question that we all probably should want to know the answer to, paying attention to Eichmann is actually worthwhile.
Thank you for that, Roger. I think that was really good. And the thing that I'm seeing what a bunch of people are saying about civilization. I think it's really important. But I also think that, like, one of the reasons why I really like what you're saying is because I think there has to be a way for the common person, for the everyday person, for that person to be capable of justice. And it's like, it isn't true that every person is able to read through many, 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 many different documents and books and things of the sort. Like, there has to be a way for a society to arrive at justice. And it's like, so thank you for what you're saying, and thanks for struggling with my honesty, for sure.
No, look, honesty is what we're after, and I thank you for it. That was great. All right, the last question for George. Go ahead, George.
I'll be brief. Just want to add a take on this situation from one of my favorite Polish Jewish authors, who is also a Holocaust survivor of somewhat questionable innocence. But here's his take on it. The banality of existence has been so amply demonstrated that there's no need for us to discuss it any further. Period. He didn't go after Eichmann, he went after the world.
Yeah. So yes, and obviously Arendt is going to disagree with that, right? For her, the point is to love the world. And she's going to try and defend the world as not banal, even though it is evil at times. And that's a distinction she's going to hold on to. So I think it's I think that's one of the greatest fundamental approaches of Arendt's thinking and work, that she resists the easy temptation to call the world worthless or unlovable or the banality of existence. I'm not, I mean, obviously this poet has his reasons and I understand that, but count me an Arendtian on that side. I think the temptation to say it's all bullshit, to excuse my French, is one that Arendt rightly resists. This was great. Thank you all very much. You have 2 weeks off. I hope you enjoy it. It's spring here at Bard. By the time I come back, I hope it's spring fully and sprung. And we'll see you on March 29th, reading Arendt, An Expert on the Jewish Question. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and see you soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you, God.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you. Bye-bye.
Wonderful
Thank you.
ending.
Gracias,
Good
gracias,
Ciao.
professor.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
And good
Bye-bye.
shows.
Ciao, ciao.